Good evening. Firstly, a little bit about me, in case you don't know me, although actually I recognise most of you. Before coming to Oxford, I was a submariner in the Royal Navy for 21 years during the final years of the Cold War. I have naval and army ancestry, and the father of one of my godmothers was killed in the RAF during the Second World War, flying a Mosquito aircraft from Malta on a sortie to Rome in 1943. So I know a little bit about all three services. And this evening I'm going to start with talking about our own war memorials in and outside the church, and then talk in more detail just about 4 individuals associated with our parish. The first memorial you walked past on your way in, which is the main war memorial outside, which was completed in 1920 in time for the ceremony on the 11th of November 1920, which is also when the cenotaph in London was unveiled. And although it is in our churchyard, it's important to appreciate that it's not just for the Anglicans who died in our parish. I've never really investigated this, but I expect some of the fallen were Roman Catholics, and there is even one Methodist who, in fact, is buried in the churchyard by the former Quarry Methodist Church, a private George Ski or Skye of the Oxford and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. Secondly, just inside the church porch, which you probably didn't see because it was dark, is a stone plaque with a list of the fallen from the First World War. There's no corresponding list for the Second World War. I did look into coordinating one, but after over a year fighting diocesan bureaucracy just to get the war memorial outside cleaned in time for the Great War centenary, and I failed, it was only cleaned afterwards, I'm afraid that I gave up. Somebody else needs to take on this project. Meanwhile, the definitive list for the Second World War is just a plasticized card kept by the vicar. The third one is up there on the south wall to Roslyn Curzon Evely. It's one of the very few memorials inside this church, and indeed the only war memorial inside. And I'll say more about him later. The Second World War memorial, which you can see but not see because it's dark, is the east window, which was designed in 1951 by Sir Ninian Comper, who is best known really as an architect, but also he designed many stained glass windows, including some in Westminster Abbey, under which his ashes are buried. You can read more about our window in the 150th anniversary book about the church's history. Perhaps we still sell at the back, do we? Yes. Yeah. Right. Yes. And there's actually a very similar design, and if you haven't ever seen it, do come back in daylight to see it. It is a very, very glorious window. And it's very similar to one he designed a year before in Southwark Cathedral. Finally, and I'm sure not many people know about this, in the north of the sanctuary is a wooden bench, and on it is engraved in memory of Sub-Lieutenant Hubert Horace Richardson, RNVR, organist of Holy Trinity, 1937 to 1941. I'd forgotten about this memorial myself, and only looked at it a couple of days ago, and in fact had been turned around so you couldn't see the name, because that was facing the wall. because he had been an organist, it may have originally been intended to be an organ bench when the organ was there, and maybe it was removed to the sanctuary after we got the new Tikel organ. Right, so those are, as far as I know, the only memorials we've got in the church. There are also, I think it's 5 Commonwealth War Grave headstones in the churchyard, mainly people who either died in training or from injuries after they returned to the area. So, turning now to 4 of the fallen, I did most of the research about 12 to 15 years ago for a series of articles in the parish magazine, but have been researching the 4th one over the last couple of days. And when doing this research, there's a large element of luck as to what one finds, although, as you perhaps might expect, there's usually more information available about officers in school and university histories. So I'll start then with Roslin Curzon Evely, which is a very splendid name. He was born in Eccles on the west side of Manchester in Lancashire on the 13th of May 1885, and was educated at Rugby School and the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, and was appointed to the 2nd Battalion of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, which you'll often see abbreviated as OBLI, but I've been assured it's very poor to actually call it that. And so that was in October 1903 that he started with them. So he was a career army officer. His grandfather, Colonel Frederick Charles Evely, had been in the 20th Regiment, which became the Lancashire Fusiliers, and his service included the Crimean War. His father was Colonel Frederick John Evely, and he served in the 2nd Battalion from 1872 to 1905, and had fought in the Boer War, and was captured and imprisoned in Pretoria in the same camp as Winston Churchill. And Churchill was the only British prisoner that I know of to escape successfully from the Boers, and he tells his story in the first volume of his autobiography, My Early Life. It is an excellent read, and there's also a film version of this called The Young Winston, which occasionally appears on the Film 4 channel. By the start of the First World War, Roslin Evely was a captain, aged 29, and assistant adjutant of his battalion, having served as the ADC to the Major General commanding Mauritius, in the days when we had exciting foreign postings, from 1906 to 1910. His battalion was sent out to France on the 14th of August 1914, just 10 days after the declaration of war, and during the initial mobile stage of the war. He participated in the 220-mile retreat from Mons, probably mainly on foot. The German advance was halted at the First Battle of the Marne, which prevented the capture of Paris and denied the Germans an early victory. On the 13th of September, the Battle of the Aisne, A-I-S-N-E, commenced as the Allies pursued the retreating German forces, and it was then that both sides started digging defences and trench warfare began. 2nd Battalion were initially held in reserve at Soupir. Then, on the 16th of September, Evely was sent with 2 companies to relieve the 2nd Battalion of the Grenadier Guards in a farm called La Cour de Soupir. Towards evening, a shell unluckily landed amongst them, killing 11 men and wounding over 50, including Eveleigh. He returned to duty 2 days later, but was killed outright by shell fire in the evening of the 19th of September and is buried in Soupir churchyard. At the time, his mother, by then a widow, was living in Elderwick House, which is down the Ridings, which is the reason why Roslin is commemorated in our church. It's believed he was the first member of the parish to be killed, just 7 weeks after the start of the war. After my magazine article was published, I was contacted by Barbara Dean, who sadly died quite recently, who remembered as a child living next door to Roslin's brother Elliot in the Kitchener barracks in Chatham. Barbara's father and Elliot were both senior officers in the Royal Engineers, and Barbara and her sister remember playing with Elliot's 2 sons. Alan Day also remembered hearing an interview with a Robin Eveleigh on Radio 4 in the early stages of the Falklands War in 1982. This Robin was in fact Elliot's younger son, who had left the army after commanding the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Green Jackets and started an international shipping company which is now being run by one of his sons. I was given an introduction to Robin's widow, who lives in Chelsea, and the main distinction of Chelsea is where Agatha Christie is buried, and she lived nearby. And I had a fascinating discussion with her about their family history. It turns out that Roslin was the 5th generation to serve in the army, and his great-great-grandfather, a Lieutenant General John Eveleigh, the Royal Engineers, served under General Elliot at the Great Siege of Gibraltar in 1779 to 1783. His great-grandfather, General Henry Eveleigh, served in the Royal Horse Artillery in the Peninsular Campaign under the Duke of Wellington. A more distant relative, John Eveleigh, who lived from 1560 to 1604, was the principal of Hart House in Oxford, which was merged in 1874 with Magdalen Hall to form Hertford College. And the Bridge of Sighs was built around this time by Thomas Graham Jackson, who was a pupil of our architect, Sir George Gilbert Scott. And the third sort of coincidence was that I discovered that Elliot had retired to Long Wittenham and lived in a house that is now called Eveleigh's, although it wasn't called that when he lived there. And the current owners I know, and I visited their house several times without realizing this connection. And the house has a beautiful garden which goes right down to the river with particularly fine irises, and used to open under the National Garden Scheme in late May, but sadly no more. So that's Eveleigh. The next one is a naval officer called Peter Lee. His full name, which is rather splendid, is Peter Lauriston Charles Melville Lee, and he was born in Headington in late 1918, the only child of Rupert Henry Melville Lee and Catherine Child, and they'd married in 1916 in St Andrew's Church, Old Headington. Rupert Lee, his father, was serving in the army, so they moved frequently, but their family home was Stoke House in Old Heading, which is now part of Ruskin Hall. And that then was the home of Peter's grandfather, William Melville Lauriston Lee, and he had worked for MI5 and had been head of the section spying on the British socialist movement. But there was a controversial prosecution in 1917 concerning an alleged plot to assassinate Lloyd George, and the section of the MI5 existence then became public and had to be closed down. William's brother So that's the great uncle of Peter Lee, I'm really meant to be talking about, but there's rather interesting diversions, was Arthur Lee, who was the first Viscount Lee of Fareham down in Hampshire, and he gave his house, Chequers, to the nation as a country retreat to the Prime Minister. Anyway, so I expect Peter moved around quite a bit with his father's army appointments, and then he attended the Naval College at Dartmouth, probably starting when he was aged about 13. And the only fact I found about his time there was that he was awarded the Harold Tennyson Memorial Prize, which was awarded to the top student in English literature and was founded by the second Baron Tennyson, son of the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, in memory of his son, Sub-Lieutenant Harold Tennyson, who was killed in 1916 serving in HMS Viking when the ship hit a mine off Boulogne. After completing his training and promotion to sub-lieutenant, he volunteered for submarines, as I did, and joined HMS Odin probably in early 1940. HMS Odin was the first of 6 Odin-class submarines designed for ocean operations and was about double the size of most submarines at the time. At the start of the Second World War, she was based in Hong Kong. Then, after a brief period off Colombo, she moved to the Mediterranean in early 1940, based at Alexandria. In June 1940, she was operating in the Gulf of Taranto when she was rammed and depth-charged by 2 Italian destroyers with the loss of all her crew. The date of her sinking is unclear, with different accounts quoting the 14th and the 27th of June, Italian record-keeping. Initially, she was probably just listed as missing, and it may have been months or years before the exact circumstances and date of her sinking were discovered. Her wreck has yet to be found, but as diving and submersible technology improves, wrecks, particularly in the Mediterranean, are gradually being found and identified, and the wreck of a sister submarine, HMS Olympus, was found off Malta in 2008. The Odin class were large, slow, and unmaneuverable submarines, and 4 out of the 6 of the class were lost in the Mediterranean. There were seldom survivors, and during the war, the Royal Navy were to lose a total of 75 out of the 215, or a third of submarines deployed in combat operations. There's one mystery which I've yet to solve, which is why Peter Lee is actually on our list, because he'd been living in Old Headington. And if anybody has any ideas, do let me know. Right. Thirdly, to maintain some balance, an RAF casualty, and any Welshman here, please correct me, Glendower Vincent Fisher. On the evening of the 17th of September 1939, so just 2 weeks after the start of the Second World War, HMS Courageous, an aircraft carrier, was on anti-submarine patrol to the southwest of Ireland and was hit by 2 torpedoes and sank within 20 minutes. This was the first British warship to be sunk, and 519 men out of a total crew of 1,260 were lost. The attack had been carried out by the German U-boat U-29, commanded by Otto Schuhart, which escaped a counterattack by 2 British destroyers and returned safely to her base at Wilhelmshaven. One of these casualties was Glendower Vincent Fisher, and he was an RAF aircraftsman first class attached to one of the Fairey Swordfish squadrons embarked in HMS Courageous. And all that I've been able to find out about him, thanks to the research of the Headington local historian Stephanie Jenkins, that he was born in about 1917, and his parents, John William and Anne Elizabeth Fisher, were living in 43 Langley Close during the war, and then moved to Kennington in about 1946. It's possible there are still people living in Headington who knew his family, and I'd be most interested to hear. HMS Courageous had been built as a cruiser in late 1916 and mainly operated in the North Sea for the remainder of the First World War. She had been placed in reserve at the end of the war, but when rearmament started, she was converted into an aircraft carrier in 1928. It was the fourth warship to bear the name. The most recent HMS Courageous was a nuclear submarine, which was in service from 1971 until 1993, and I served in her as the first lieutenant for a couple of years. Right, the final one then is the name on the bench in the sanctuary, who is another naval officer, I'm afraid, Hubert Horace Richardson. I've only had a couple of days looking at his life, but so far I've discovered the following. His parents came from Cowes on the north coast of the Isle of Wight, where Hubert was born in 1921. The family moved to Oxford in the late 1920s, presumably to find work. And from a register in 1939, when Hubert was about 18, he was then working for a removals firm, probably a local firm like Jacobs or Lucas, and was living at number 6 Stile Road. The house is currently for sale. I walked past it today, actually, and it's next to the Co-op car park. Also written on this document against his name was the word musician. Engraving on the bench states he was the organist at Holy Trinity from 1937 to 1941, so perhaps he'd been taught to play the organ by his predecessor. The other possibility was that he attended one of Oxford's 3 choir schools, in which playing musical instruments was and still is an important part of their education. But otherwise, I know nothing about his education and childhood. He probably, there's an awful lot of probablys, I'm afraid, possibilities, joined the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve in 1941, and his choice for the Navy was unusual for someone living in Oxford, but perhaps being born by the sea in Cowes and still having relatives there affected his choice. He went into the Fleet Air Arm, and by 1942 was a qualified pilot. In early 1944, 829 Squadron was reformed as at the Royal Naval Air Station in Leon-Solent in southern Hampshire, flying Fairey Barracuda torpedo bombers, which were a successor to the Fairey Swordfish, the biplanes. And they embarked in the aircraft carrier HMS Victorious for Operation Tungsten. And just very briefly, the German battleship Tirpitz had been badly damaged in September 1943 by midget submarines, but they were able to repair her, and intelligence suggested she was about to go to sea. So on the 30th of March, the Home Fleet sailed, and a coordinated attack was launched from 5 aircraft carriers. We now have just 2, the whole of the Navy, and this was just the Home Fleet, on the 3rd of April, and they inflicted considerable damage to the superstructure of the Tirpitz. And they'd been caught out by surprise, but we still lost 9 British airmen, including Hubert Richardson. The Germans recovered their bodies, and they now lie in the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery in Tromsø. I visited Tromsø about 10 years ago, but didn't realize this at the time. We'll have to revisit one day see the cemetery. And incidentally, Tromsø is a beautiful city with a fascinating polar exploration museum. Hubert was unmarried, but his sister married an ironmonger called Andrew Stiles. So perhaps there are or were nephews and nieces, or even great-nephews and nieces. So I've just spoken in more detail about just 4 of the fallen. There are many more stories to be told. When I visit a church or see a war memorial, I'll often choose 1 or 2 names and look them up when I get home. It's my way of remembering them. But unless you actually come across relatives, it's actually much easier researching the First World War dead using websites like Ancestry, as documents like the census are now available online, whereas there's very little for the Second World War. And the Headington local historian Stephanie Jenkins has much more on her website. Our Remembrance service this coming Sunday is when we remember all those who gave their lives in this parish so that others and future generations could live in peace and freedom.
But I hope that you will feel able to spend some time at John at the door, maybe buy a coffee, and are all so welcome at our Remembrance service on Sunday. There'll be a service in church at 10 a.m. and then the act of remembrance at the War Memorial at 10:45. And of course, you're welcome to come back for the next talk in our series, which will be on Wednesday, the 4th of December, where I'm going to be talking a bit about Mary, who she is and what she means to us. But in closing this evening, please join me in thanking John so much for this really amazing talk.
Mm-hmm.